really happy to be here, really happy, because as Lena said, my work as a career guidance practitioner and as a researcher has been very heavily focused on island communities and small communities. And I have a long-standing interest in the Faroe Islands, Greenland and Åland as small communities and as self-governing regions. So I'm really, really pleased to be here and to be able to speak to you, especially at the beginning of your project. I will speak in English. I hope that's okay. If there's anything that's unclear, please ask a question or put a question in the chat, and there'll be time for questions at the end, hopefully, as well. And I'll try and speak clearly. But I thought what I would talk about today is the topic for this group, which is supporting NEET young people. And I'm going to talk particularly about island contexts. That's my name and my email address. I'm always really happy to connect with people outside of these sessions who share similar interests. So what I thought we would cover today, I'll give you some background to myself. Everyone else has given background to themselves, so I will say something about my own background as well. I won't say too much actually about why supporting NEET young people is important in island contexts. I'm going to skip straight into these last bullet points here about the challenges and opportunities of supporting young people in island communities and some ideas or suggestions for good practice in island communities as well. So first, for some background, this is a map of Scotland, and I have circled the island communities of Orkney and Shetland. For about 15 years, I worked in the Orkney Islands, which are the group of islands furthest south, furthest towards the Scottish mainland. I was a careers advisor working in schools. I worked in the community. I worked with NEET young people. And then after that job, I moved into working for the University of the Highlands and Highlands, which is a university, and it's based across the whole of the north of Scotland, really. So the Highland region and the Islands region. And my job was to develop and coordinate career services for the university. So this background in working in small places really led me to some research interests. I was interested in how do we support young people in small communities? And I felt that maybe we didn't talk about that enough as a field. So my background is in career guidance. Within career guidance, we often don't really speak that much about small communities, and I wanted to understand more about what careers look like in small communities and how we can support young people. The pictures here are of Shetland on the left and Orkney on the right, quite different in landscape, but they're similar sizes of communities, about 20,000 people in Orkney and about 20,000 people in Shetland as well. So a little bit smaller than Åland, Faroe Islands and Greenland. For the last year and a half, I have been living in Denmark. So although my background is in Scotland, and I will talk mostly about Scotland today, for the last year and a half, I have been doing a project in Denmark. And this project has looked at career guidance in these 3 island communities in Denmark. So my PhD that was conducted in Scotland looked at how young people make decisions about careers and their movements, where they move to and how they move. And this project is focused on if we understand that place is important to young people in their decision making, how can we respond to that as careers advisors, as teachers, and within the communities. So I'll speak a little bit about Denmark as well in this presentation. I hope the background I've given you has said something about who I am and where I'm from, but these points are really critical. My focus is on island communities. My focus is centered on island communities. Often we think about career systems generally, and then we try and apply them. We apply that into island communities. And I'm interested in starting from small communities or from an island community. What does it mean if we think about career guidance and supportive needs, starting from the communities that we all live in, or almost all of us live in this meeting? So that's one very important starting point for this presentation, is I'm starting from the island communities themselves. The other very important point for me is that I start from a practical focus. What does this mean for support of young people in island communities? So I've realized that in a lot of my research work, I always come back to, what does this mean? What does this mean for us who live and work in island communities? So that's how this presentation is going to be focused. I'll focus on islands themselves, and I will focus on practical questions. Like I said, I'm not going to say too much about this because I think this will be familiar to you, but NEET young people are often a special group of young people within policy and the focus that we have in career guidance. These are young people who are not in education, employment or training. There are concerns over long-term prospects for young people who find themselves not in education, employment or training. And people are not in education, employment or training, they are NEET for a number of different reasons. There can be some quite complex reasons for why people are NEET. In rural areas, the concern around NEET young people intersects with concerns around community development, economic development, population sustainability. These are all questions that I know will be the focus of some regions, certainly some regions within Åland and Faroe Islands and Greenland. Often the most peripheral and rural areas have very considerable questions around population and economic sustainability. But like I say, I want to focus on practice. This is how I want to use our time. So I thought we would start with thinking about what service provision looks like for NEET young people in island communities. How do we support NEET young people? The first thing to say is that what we know about effective approaches to career support and effective approaches to supporting NEETs is that support involves lots of different services, lots of different professionals, all providing maybe slightly different things. So we often talk about career guidance systems and systems for supporting NEET young people in terms of an ecosystem. So this is in the international literature and thinking about countries that are much bigger than the territories that we live and work in. But you will find discussion of ecosystems of support. And some of the support structures that are part of this ecosystem will be things like information services. So the kinds of services that provide young people with information about learning and work. That could be an online service, it could be paper materials, but it's increasingly online. And it might be individual people giving some kind of information to other people. Career guidance is a one-to-one service which is normally more in depth than information, and it's providing advice or guidance. Sometimes these things are talked about as separate, advice and guidance, and sometimes they're talked about together. But normally it's a one-to-one service where young people are supported by a trained careers professional through a conversation or a series of conversations that gives them advice about learning and work. Then we have career learning and education, which is often delivered in schools and is often delivered by teachers. So this might be teachers who are teaching sometimes dedicated courses or modules on career choice or on educational choice. Sometimes it's teachers teaching young people about careers, the workplace, learning as part of a wider personal and social education, or within the subjects that they teach. So there are different ways of delivering career learning, but it's a sort of kind of provision which is often delivered in schools by teachers. Then we have a whole range of provision that I've just called employability provision, but these are things like mentoring schemes, work placement schemes, support with job searching and applications, so interview coaching, help with writing applications, those kinds of things. So these are sometimes delivered by, they can be delivered by all kinds of different people, actually. And work placement schemes might be developed and delivered by a school, but they also might be work taster sort of schemes, which might be through public employment services or elsewhere. So this is a taste of some kinds of different provision that is helpful to young people in making careers decisions and in finding pathways through learning and work. The other thing that I've put on this slide is around health and mental health provision and criminal justice provision. This is important, bearing in mind that NEET young people, like I say, are NEET often for lots of different reasons, and they can experience issues around mental health, issues around criminality or engagement with the justice system. They can be carers or young carers, and these things can have a big impact on young people and their ability to enter education or employment. So health and mental health provision and criminal justice provision, those kinds of things, are also really important in this landscape of support for young people. In some countries and in some regions, you might have careers provision, dedicated provision about learning and work that's offered through mental health services or through criminal justice services. So I was in Australia a few months ago, and one of the places I visited in Australia was a young people's mental health service that delivered quite a lot of career support. So, like I say, these things, we might think about them in the school system, but we might think about them outside of the school system as well. So outside of the school system, through public employment services and other forms of provision, you will also have career information, guidance, career education, often in the form of employability programs and other kinds of services. So an ecosystem of support. Now, the key challenge, I guess, for those of us who are involved in this kind of area is that if you have an ecosystem, if you have lots of different services, then how do you coordinate those services? Coordination becomes a big challenge. We need to make sure that we are not duplicating services. We need to make sure that we are providing consistent services. We're not contradicting each other, and we need to identify where there are gaps in provision as well. So there are different forms of coordination structure that are possible. National policy frameworks or policy and strategy frameworks are often valuable in articulating how these services work together. Who is delivering support? How are they working in partnership? Who is responsible for what? Beyond sort of a policy framework, there are different ways of structuring services and structuring responsibilities. And I thought I would mention this here because there is a difference between England and Scotland, which I think helps to highlight how there are different possibilities. So an example is in England that the responsibility for career services and support of young people in schools is the school's responsibility primarily. So the school is responsible for organising the different kinds of provision for young people, including those who are at risk of becoming NEET. In Scotland, there's a national career service. So there's a separate career service that is all age. So it will work with young people, NEET young people in schools, and adults at threat of redundancy, and so on. So in Scotland, the responsibility for career guidance, career services lies primarily with the national service, not with the schools, but the national service works in partnership with schools. So there are different ways of organising your career systems. You might also have national or local coordination structures or forums. So you can have national sort of meetings, structures to bring people together to talk about career services, but you can also have local versions of those. And then at a really local level, in the work that individual careers practitioners or employability workers do, there might be approaches to partnership working. So individual careers staff or teachers might work in partnership with other organisations. So I was going to talk a little bit about what this means for small island contexts. I should say I used the phrase small islands. I'm aware that Greenland is a very big island geographically, but in population is still relatively small. So I'm going to talk about what structures for careers provision look like in small islands. I'm going to talk about Orkney because this is the community that I know best as a kind of example. To understand Orkney, it's important to understand Scottish careers provision because unlike Åland, the Faroe Islands and Greenland, Orkney doesn't have the same level of autonomy. So Orkney is very much part of the Scottish system. So on this slide, I have described some features of the Scottish system so you can understand a little bit about how it works. There's a national career strategy in Scotland, which outlines who delivers what in terms of career services to young people and how young people are supported. Within that strategy, Skills Development Scotland are named as a key agency. Skills Development Scotland are a national all-age career service, like I say. They provide online information, so they have a database of jobs and careers. Young people can look up information about how to enter those jobs. And online have a number of tools as well that young people can engage with. They have careers advisors who are based all over Scotland. So in Orkney, I think there might be about 4 or 5 careers advisors, but Skills Development Scotland employ careers advisors. They are trained and qualified within the Scottish system. And those careers advisors will provide one-to-one advice and guidance for anyone in Scotland. Skills Development Scotland is also relatively unusual internationally because it has responsibility for some elements of skills provision. So it has responsibility for things like apprenticeships, and it engages in skills mapping, so trying to understand the skills needs of the different communities and address educational development to address those skills needs. So that's Skills Development Scotland. Schools have a careers advisor from SDS or more than one attached to them. So career services in the schools are provided by SDS careers advisors, but schools also have developing the young workforce coordinators who are responsible for employer engagement with the schools, youth workers, mental health services. These things vary in how they're delivered and to what level, depending on the school, but most schools will have a variety of services within them. Schools have a responsibility for career learning and education. So they do teach elements of career within the classroom, but they do that in partnership with SDS. There's also further and higher education provision, so colleges, universities will be delivering some forms of career support. There's public employment services. In the UK, we would call this the job centre. But public employment services support young people once they're out of school to find work and employment. And then we have community and voluntary organisations who are increasingly involved in delivering employability activities to young people who experience specific kinds of need. In each region of Scotland, there's a local employability partnership. I'll talk about that a bit later, because this is a way of coordinating things at a local level. So that's the national context. If we think about Orkney, Orkney is relatively small. It's 20,000 people or so, like I say. The way that career services are delivered in Orkney is influenced by what happens in Scotland. But there are certain challenges that come from being a small community. The map on this slide is of Orkney. The other image on this slide is a publication by Ronald Sultana about career guidance in small states. Now, he was writing about Malta, the country of Malta, which is considerably larger than the Faroe Islands, Greenland, Åland, or Orkney. So it's about 550,000 people, I think, something like that. But the kinds of challenges that Ronald Sultana was talking about in terms of a small state like Malta, even though it's much bigger than any of the communities we're involved in, are similar to some of the issues that I find working in smaller communities still. So the kinds of things that Ronald talks about and that I also talk about are issues around limited resources. So in small communities, we have very small numbers sometimes of NEET young people. We have small numbers of advisors. We have relatively small numbers of schools, small numbers of services to support young people. So we just don't have the numbers that larger communities have, and that raises questions for how we deliver services. We also have distinctive labour markets which are prone to flux. So there can be very high variation in Orkney about numbers of NEET young people, for example, because the economy fluctuates. A good example of this is the oil and gas industry in Orkney and Shetland in the 1970s, I think, created a huge employment boom. Fishing is also very important in Shetland. And so if there's an impact on the oil and gas industry or on the fishing industry, you can see big changes, relatively big changes in these communities, which influences the context that young people are in. We have personalised structures and hierarchies. So when you work with a policymaker, like somebody in the community council, or if you work with a teacher, or if you work with the young people themselves, you're a careers advisor, you will often know that person directly or indirectly. So they might be your neighbour, your cousin's child, or your cousin's boyfriend. They are likely to be known to you in some form. So this changes the way that services can feel. You often have blended roles and multi-specialisms. So because we have small numbers of professionals, small numbers of young people who are NEET, what can happen is that you might have one person delivering multiple services that in another community would be separate. As an example, when I worked in Orkney, I worked with young people in school, young people who are NEET, and adults in the community. Now, if I worked in the city in Scotland, those roles may well have been separate. But because the community is relatively small, it's likely that we're going to see blended roles in career guidance, but also in things like teaching and medicine and other professions. Not so much in Orkney, because Orkney is part of a national careers system, I guess, through the Scottish system. But small countries, small states can face challenges with training small numbers of professionals. Because there might only be 4, 10, 20 careers advisors in a small place. There's a question about how we train those people. It may not be feasible to run a training course every single year at master's level, for example. It may be, but there can be real challenges with how do we train professionals. In Scotland, the way this works in Orkney is that historically, Skills Development Scotland have recruited careers advisors into Orkney, trainee careers advisors, who have then done a lot of on-the-job training combined with some time at universities in mainland Scotland to complete a master's level qualification. That's the challenges of smallness, but what I've written at the bottom of this slide, and is really important, is that we need to remember that there are real opportunities. Because we are different, small communities are different. There are opportunities in small communities. And these are picked up by Ronald and in my work too. Opportunities for innovation, for doing things differently. We have very close connections often between policy and practice, so we can often do things more quickly. And we know where to find resources because we know who's around. And we have close relationships and often quite high buy-in or motivation within the people who are working and supporting needs. And this is really important to remember. It can be very easy to think about small places as being full of challenges, but it's really important to remember that we are also full of opportunity. I just wanted to say something briefly about, I've spoken about smallness in terms of small states like Malta and small regions, I guess, like Orkney. But within our territories, we also have challenges of smallness. And I think Lena mentioned this when she was talking about Greenland as well. Within Greenland, the Faroe Islands and Åland, you will have communities that are further away from the centres of your community where there are going to be challenges of smallness, even more so. In this map of the Orkney Islands, I've circled I've circled a number of islands which are north of the mainland, the main island in Orkney. They're relatively distant, so it takes about 2 hours maybe on a ferry to get between these islands and the main island. These islands have populations up to about 700 or 800 people. 3 of them have small schools where you can complete all of your education. So a young person could go all the way through school in 3 of these communities. Now, provision of career services to these communities faces additional challenges with smallness. So where there's about 4 or 5 practitioners within Orkney, careers people within Orkney, in these small communities, the careers practitioners fly in typically a few times a year. So they go to the school a few times a year, whereas in the main community, they are in much more frequently. So with these small islands, when you're a careers practitioner, you have to think a little bit differently. You might be only in the school a few times, so you might rely more on online and virtual provision, video conference, email, telephone. You might also need to think about how you cost or fund your careers advisors to go out or your young people to come in to the main community. I've written down here something about balancing local and national information, which is to recognise that sometimes career services in the very small communities don't feel relevant or don't feel as relevant to young people as they maybe do in main larger communities. This is because in a small community, some of the very small communities, it can feel like, well, I know everyone in this community, I know every job that exists. So what can somebody else, what can a careers advisor coming from somewhere else tell me about? What information will they have that's useful? So in these communities, my personal feeling is that we rely quite a lot on teachers, people, professionals who are in place, who are in these communities to act as intermediaries, to work with young people, to encourage them to access career guidance, to signpost them. So that's some of the ways that career services work in these small communities. The other thing to bear in mind is that some of the young people, NEET young people, who face the largest barriers are in these communities. So when you work as a careers professional or delivering other kinds of support for young people, these communities can be very challenging because there may simply be no jobs available at a point in time in a community like this. So my feeling is, and I'll talk about this in a moment, is that innovation, flexibility and bespoke provision is what's important in the smallest communities. We need to think really flexibly about how we work with young people here. One of the really good things, I think, in Scottish policy recently has been the introduction of an Islands Act, which means that all public policy and public service provision needs to be island proofed. And what this means is that when a careers service or some other form of service is designing its provision, there is a requirement that they think about islands and they think about whether what they are planning is going to be effective in the islands, whether islanders might be disadvantaged. So this is one way that in Scotland, policymakers are being encouraged to think from an island perspective. And it's very helpful, I think, when to have these communities in mind when we think about the approaches that we are designing to support young people. Just very briefly, about 5-6 years ago, I think, I did do some work with Greenland and the Faroe Islands, specifically about career guidance. And in this publication, which I wrote with Elizabeth Holm, Deirdre Hansen and Kistara Ball, we talked about Greenland and the Faroe Islands specifically and the value of having distinctive policy approaches which are appropriate to the distinctive contexts of these islands. And we talked about some of these things that I've already talked about in terms of Orkney and other small communities, the value of the strength in the communities of being relatively small, having strong professional networks, having a strong motivation to support young people in the communities. We talked about the value of a lifelong learning approach or a lifelong approach. And we talked about, in terms of training, we talked about the value of training careers professionals through a Nordic collaboration, which existed some years ago now, and I think was delivered through the University of the Faroe Islands, but used people from elsewhere in the Nordic region. And we also talked about the possibility for innovation in these communities. So this publication is there if anyone is interested in it. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to move on to thinking about I've spoken about some of the challenges of small islands, and I've indicated that there are also possibilities in small islands, opportunities. And I'm going to talk about these possibilities and opportunities specifically now. So I started with a question: what are rural and island communities good at? Now, I did a piece of research work some years ago now on healthcare. Nothing to do with NEET young people, nothing to do with employment. But it was in these very small islands in Orkney. And what I did focus groups with the community, and I asked the community about care provision and those kinds of things. And what I heard was, I had a lovely interaction with somebody who said, the thing is, here, I look out of my window and I can see my elderly neighbour's house below my house. And I know that she lights the fire every morning at a certain time. So when I look out the window, if there's smoke coming out of her chimney, I know she's fine. But if I look out of the window and there is no smoke coming out of the chimney, then I know that I need to go and check on my neighbour. And I think for me, that sums up what small communities are often good at. People know each other, they look out for each other, and there can be a sort of very informal way of supporting each other. So my suggestion is that rural and island communities benefit from clear guidance and policy structures, some of what I've talked about before. We need to understand how we are organising the ecosystem of services, and we need to have a clear understanding of who is responsible for what and how. But we need policy structures which are sufficiently flexible or island-proofed, to use the Scottish phrase. We need to have coordination between local partners, and we need to have the ability to be creative and capitalise on community strengths. And I've got some examples here. So the first example is from Scotland. This is local employability partnerships. So these are local partnerships that take place in every community, every local authority area, commune. They are partnerships of everybody who's involved in supporting employment and employability. So career services, public employment services, learning providers, colleges, universities, health services, and voluntary sector organisations. They meet regularly, and they're responsible for developing a plan for how to address employability in their area. And to develop this plan, they need to gather information and analyse information so that they understand where the needs are in their community. And then they have a responsibility for working out how to design activities which are going to address the needs in their community. So they have a responsibility for allocating funding and coordinating activities. What this means is that there is a sort of national structure, there's the requirement to have a local employability partnership. So the structure is really important, but then within that structure, there is that autonomy and flexibility to work with the strength within the island community and to address the specific needs within the community. So in Orkney, some things that have happened are careers fairs, careers weeks, development of support groups for particular needs. So work has happened with one of the local mental health charities, for example. They've developed courses or activities in some of the small islands in Orkney, and they work on pathway planning. So looking at the numbers of NEET young people and then discussing the needs of those NEET young people and working out where there needs to be additional support. So this kind of approach enables, there's a structure that then enables local flexibility in delivery. This is an example from England. So in England, in English schools, there are a set of benchmarks for careers provision that schools are expected to meet. One of those is around employer engagement. This example is taken from a piece of research I looked at good practice in English schools in employer engagement. One of the challenges for rural areas is that there is a lack of large employers, or that there might only be like one big industry or one big employer. So how do you bring employers into your school? And one of the examples of good practice that I found was that one rural school sending a letter to all its parents and inviting the parents in to provide information about their jobs. So again, this is about using community strength, working with the community of parents within a structure, a kind of national structure, which says you as a school are expected to have employer engagement activities. So you've got the national sort of structure, and then you've got some flexibility in local delivery. This example comes from Denmark, from my most recent project, and the website link is at the bottom there. In small communities, the access to youth activities can be limited. In one of the communities I've been working in Denmark, there was a sort of heritage educational sort of place that was at risk of closure. And what community partners did in this community was they worked together. So they worked together to pool their resources, to work out where they could find financial resources to save this provision. Again, some of this was facilitated through the fact that I was arranging these meetings regularly with people. So there was a sort of structure that meant that local partners came together, they talked about the needs of young people, and then from that, they then developed a plan to ensure that this provision, this service, remained available. And the last example here is from my work directly. So my work is focused particularly on career guidance. That's what I'm interested in. And I'm interested in how trained careers advisors, so I would understand that it is important that careers practitioners have a level of skills development. They have a level of competence to work as careers practitioners. But in rural areas, there are particular dimensions to work as a careers practitioner, which means that our work might look a bit different. So one of the things that I've written about a little bit is the way that career guidance in smaller communities needs to take into account wider life questions. Should I move? Should I stay? And bearing in mind that moving and staying is often related to questions of family and care, and relationships, you might also take into your career guidance work some focus on these areas. And I've written a little bit about how different approaches to information and information gathering might be useful in small communities, the importance of bearing in mind that our professional boundaries might look a bit different, and so on. And on this slide, I've put a link to a LinkedIn group that I've just set up, which is for people working in rural career guidance. Anybody in this meeting who's involved in career guidance would be very welcome to join this group. It's where we consider what career guidance practice might look like in small places. So again, you might have a kind of national competence structure for careers practitioners, but then also you need some thinking and some flexibility about how things are delivered in rural communities. Now, I'm approaching the end of my time, but I just wanted to say something about outcomes, particularly because we're thinking about NEET young people. So NEET means not in education, employment or training. And you'd think that a good outcome would be to get those young people into education, employment or training. But as I've mentioned, there can be very significant restrictions on what is available in very small communities. So this can be a real constraint. Added to this, we know that NEET young people often have other significant issues, mental health, care responsibilities, and so on. And these things can stop people from moving. So quite often, in order to go into education, employment or training, a young person might need to move from a very rural community, but these additional issues can make moving even more difficult. So you've got these two things, a lack of opportunities in your immediate community and often challenges with moving. So measuring outcomes in terms of entry to education, employment or training might be problematic. I would suggest it might be setting yourself up to fail if that's the aim. But there are alternative outcome measures. So you could measure things like, if we create innovations in our support systems for NEET young people, what kind of outcomes might we see in terms of their confidence, for example? What outcomes might we see in terms of their engagement with the community, in their engagement in volunteering, their engagement in enterprise, like their own sorts of activities? On this slide, I put an image of the Career Management Skills Framework, which is the Scottish Career Management Skills Framework. But career management skills frameworks exist all over the place. A lot of countries are working with this kind of concept of career management skills. And I just wanted to say at the end of this presentation that when you're thinking about how to support needs, thinking about how you measure outcomes is valuable, and it's probably going to be useful to think about measuring outcomes in terms of career management skills or other activities, not necessarily entry into education, employment or training in a narrow sense. So I think that's just about my time. I think the key themes that I've talked about today are that supporting young people who are NEET involves multi-agency partnership working. Small communities pose some challenges, but they have some real strength as well. And I hope that what I've done has been to showcase some of that. Centralized structures and systems are helpful for guiding practice. Having policies in these communities that articulate what the aim is with young people and how different services will work together is really valuable. But also, we need a level of flexibility to capitalise on community strengths. We need provision to be relatively flexible, bespoke, and take a broad perspective on outcomes. And I've suggested that local coordination structures can be valuable for bringing partners together and creating innovative approaches. So that's all I wanted to say. I made some questions for our breakout rooms later, but I don't know, Lena, if we want to have some time for questions now in this group, or if we'll move straight into the break and straight into breakout rooms.